Have you spent a significant amount of time living outside your passport country during your developmental years? Do you come from an expat, military, diplomat, missionary, or international business family background? If so, then this podcast is for you.
Welcome to the TCK Research Podcast, where we discuss the current state of research on third culture kids, cross-culture kids, expat families, and international life in general.
My name is Andrea Schmidt, and I've been an expat for over 30 years, having lived in a total of 9 countries. I'm a coach for TCK girls, and I'm currently completing my master's degree in psychology.
And I'm Mathieu Gagnon, an adult third culture kid who grew up in 6 countries until the age of 15. And I'm now a professor of psychology in Ontario, Canada.
Every episode, we bring you a fascinating conversation with a leading researcher in the field.
If you're listening on YouTube or another platform, please subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, please press the thumbs up or like button, share it on your social media platforms, or send it to a friend.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com.
Let's jump right in.
Enjoy the podcast.
Today's guest is Dr. Ragnhild Holmen Bjørnsen. Dr. Holmen Bjørnsen is an associate professor in the Department of Social Work and Guidance, which is itself part of the Faculty of Social and Health Sciences at the University of Inland Norway, Lillehammer campus. And in this episode, we are talking about her 2020 paper entitled The Assumption of Privilege: Expectations on Emotions When Growing Up in the Norwegian Foreign Service, published in the journal Childhood.
Welcome, everybody, for our podcast with Ragnhild Holmen Bjørnsen. It's going to be an interesting one. And before we go into the paper, Ragnhild, firstly, welcome
Thank
to the
you.
podcast. You're welcome. And of course, we want to know, what is your own expat or TCK story?
So thank you very much for asking me to join in this podcast. I really appreciate this concept of interviewing researchers on these topics. I think it's very important. So I am a TCK, what we call classic TCK now, diplomats and aid and missionaries and military kids. These are what we call the classic TCKs, because in this world that we live in now, there are very many more varieties of the TCK. So I was born in Norway, and when I was 4, we moved to Bangladesh for 3 years. Then we had 1 year in Norway, and then we moved on to Pakistan for 2 years, then a couple of years in Norway, 2 years then in Iran.
Oh, wow.
And then 2 years in Norway, and then 2 years in France, close to Geneva, Switzerland. And by that time, I was 18 and had finished school, and then I moved first to Oslo and started my studies. And then during my studies in anthropology and political science, I did move around a lot, exchange students, different semesters, different years overseas. And then I began a PhD in psychological anthropology. So during my PhD is when I wrote the article that you want to discuss today.
Yeah, so I think we got already a good idea how your background, how you came from being a TCK to your research on global mobility. Would you like to add anything to that? Like what made you research global mobility in the expat and TCK life?
Yes, I think that a lot of research comes from people who have had certain experiences, and that that sparks an interest in us in different ways of what we want to study and what we want to work with in our adult life. And a lot of researchers have backgrounds that has made them choose certain topics, of course. And most research on TCKs has been done with researchers who have similar backgrounds themselves, or they have been teachers in international schools or counselors working with TCKs. So for me, I belong to a generation where we did not have the word TCK.
Right.
We didn't have any words.
Same here.
Exactly.
My
Same here.
generation. So when I was 25, I was introduced to the TCKs growing up amongst world's book.
Oh, yeah.
And that really opened a new chapter in my life where I found words to understand and reflect and talk to others about my childhood and the past that I had. And I discovered that there are other people out there who have similar childhoods, and that there was, so that was in 2005. So that's when we started really having a global discourse. That's when Facebook came. That's when, that's when the internet really started to make this TCK concept and language accessible globally.
Yeah.
A very important book that you mentioned there that I think touched a lot of people,
I think
including all three of us.
yes, it's a very simple book to read, and that makes it very accessible for very many different people. So that's the strength of the book. But I was not a psychologist. I had not studied psychology at that point. I was a social scientist, anthropology, political science. So I wanted to do research or explore this concept further, but my approach to it was from the social sciences. So thinking about how society influences and affects children and children's emotional development.
Yes, and we'll be talking about that in the paper specifically. And just to make sure, the book we're talking about for listeners, if you don't know it, Andrea, you can correct me, and Ragnhild also. It's Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds, currently the third edition by Van Rekken and Pollock. Van Rekken and Pollock. There's a Pollock father who is no longer with us, and a Pollock son also. Good. So thank you for giving us this kind of story, which is it's quite rich. I reacted internally, as you said it, to the fact that you kept coming back to Norway. You were one of these folks. That's a lot. Some people's story is coming back. It's interesting because in my story there wasn't this regular coming back, but for some, I guess it depends on countries and foreign services, where some people tend to come back for 2 years, go back, come back to that's an interesting detail. So
yes, so my parents did not work for the Foreign Service, but they worked in different aid organizations and for the UN.
Okay, that explains maybe that also.
But I know that these systems are different. Also in the Foreign Service. In the Norwegian Foreign Service, it's very common to go out overseas for 2-3 years, and then you have a period back in Norway being stationed out again. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting.
So
I
in
think
that way,
military
it's quite
service is the same, right? In many countries. Sorry to
Is it?
interrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's quite typical also for
Mm.
NATO, for example, that
For
families are
NATO.
stationed overseas for
Okay.
Yeah.
maybe 3 years, and then you have maybe 2 years back in Norway, and then overseas again. But it also depends on um, the 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 parents' choices.
Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I know that in the Norwegian Foreign Service, as an employee, you probably have more choice than in many foreign
Yeah.
services
For
and
many.
Mm.
Yeah.
organizations,
Mm.
because you can, in
Interesting.
fact, choose, oh, now for my family's sake, for example, we will have time in Norway.
Yeah. In Norway.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay,
Mm.
so let's get into your paper, which we found fascinating. Um, in your paper, you basically the point of it, as we understand it, is you're trying to understand what it means to grow up within a high mobility global context. And you focus specifically on the emotional side of this process. Uh, why were you interested in the emotional aspect? Because you see a lot of studies looking at belonging and identity. And of course, I can hear people saying that there's a big correlation between identity, belonging, and emotion. But you really chose specifically to focus on the emotional side. Why is that?
It's because from a cultural and sociological perspective, we are very influenced by our society and our cultural context about when it comes to how we develop emotionally. So when you are in a context of, for example, an employer organization like the Norwegian Foreign Service, there will be institutional norms, rules, there will be a story which will then, as we say, trickle down into family culture and then
Mhm.
into the child and how the child develops emotionally. So for me, it was fascinating to not start out with an individual child, but start out with an organization or institution and see what are the typical characteristics, what is the story of this organization, and then see how it affects families, parents, how parents understand emotions, understand the emotional situation of their children, and how this then also affects children's development, emotional development. The other reason is that I think emotions are key to understanding the TCK experience
Mm.
because typically the TCK will experience a lot of emotional ruptures along the way, and especially relationships that are broken every time you move to a new place, and trying to understand how this affects children emotionally,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to the relationships that start and then relationships that are ended or broken, and that can be that is a repetitive pattern, and
Mm.
Yeah.
how that affects children. So I wanted to focus mostly on that. But this is also a qualitative study, so that means that it was what the participants in my study gave most weight to
Yeah.
that became the focus of how I wrote that
Right.
afterwards.
Of course.
So in
And we'll
a
talk
way,
about what they gave weight to. Yeah.
yes, in a way, it is the participants in the study who decide what is going to be the focus in the end.
Yes, interesting.
And you
For listeners, I want
especially
to make sure, also when you mention how this organization's culture trickles down all the way down, by organization, you mean specifically the Norwegian Foreign Service, correct?
Yes, but you can
Okay.
apply that to very many
Yes.
employer organizations.
Yes, as a proxy for other possible. Yeah.
Yes, for example, very clearly in the military, in you know, the armed forces, there are very clear stories, clear norms and rules of how to behave and what is correct and incorrect. And so on. So you can find that, but also normal everyday institutions like the school a child goes to, that institution will affect the
Yes.
children.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we also know that different cultures have different emotional rules and norms for what is a normal feeling, what is a
Appropriate.
not
Yeah.
not normal feeling. So if we compare in different cultures, you will also find that children develop emotionally in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that answers the second question you were going to
Second
ask,
question, right?
Adriana,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Which is why childhood and why childhood matters. So maybe you can skip to the third one there
Yeah.
that we
I
had.
think we skipped to the third, to number 3,
Yeah,
yeah?
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
You also mentioned that globalization comes with its ideological myths and cultural narratives about the process and the result of global elite migration. So in this case, in your case, it was diplomatic. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? What should listeners think when they hear this sentence, especially with the relation to the emotional lives of children?
Yeah, so before globalization, we had nation states and we had nationality. We still do, but we now also have more global stories. So, but I like to compare when I talk about these narratives of a global elite, I like to compare with, for example, the stories, the narratives of a country, of a nation. Every country has this great narrative that we believe in, and that is true for us. So, for example, Norway, that was on the victory side of the Second World War, we present ourselves as those who were on the right side, for example. And those kind of stories, they do not have a lot of nuances and variation and detail. And what is interesting now in this global society that we have now and we've had for at least the last 20 years is to see that we also have these very generalized stories of, for example, who are refugees, who are global migrants, and then also who is this global elite. And when we use this word elite, and researchers also use the word elite to describe TCKs and to describe expatriates in general, then we associate a lot of things when we hear the word elite. So we associate privilege. We have that people have, families have a good financial situation, you know, these things that are implied in the word elite.
Mm.
So my way of trying to nuance that story of global elite migration is to say, well, these children, of course, are more privileged than many when it comes to family income, but they might not be emotionally privileged in the
Mm.
way that they have grown up.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're bringing us back to the concept again of emotion, and
Yeah.
and in your paper, once you explain this idea of the narrative of a global elite migration, you then present to the readers different concepts that I think it's important to take time to unpack here. Concept like emotion regulation development, concepts
Mm.
like emotion cultures, concepts like feeling rules. What can you tell us about these concepts and how they relate to these ideological myths or preconceptions about global elite migration?
So these might be concepts and words that you don't hear every day. Also,
Mm.
psychologists don't use every day, and that's more the anthropological and sociological side of this. So when we speak of emotion cultures, that means that when you are a social group, or when you are organized into an institution, and you have routines, practices, and cultural understandings within this group, you will have different cultures also for emotions. So, what
Mm.
is appropriate emotion at a given time, given place, given situation? And if we
Mm.
think about different cultures, for example, Japan and the US, we intuitively picture that yes, these are different
Yeah.
cultures, but also
Mm.
emotionally. They
Yes.
have
Mm.
Yes.
very different rules, what we then call feeling rules,
Mm.
rules of what you're supposed to
Mm.
feel, what are acceptable forms of showing emotion or not.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that
Mm.
is what we mean by emotion cultures, and that is what we mean with feeling rules. So I can give a
Mm.
very simple example is if
Yes,
it's your
please do.
wedding day, if it's your wedding
Mm-hmm.
day, and we all know it's supposed to be the happiest day of your life. So that is the expectation
The
of
pressure.
that situation and that space, and amongst your family and friends, the context is telling you this is supposed to be the best day of your life, and something else would be inappropriate. It would be inappropriate to not feel happy right now. But
Mm.
what
Mhm.
if, for example, you've had a terrible argument with your fiance the night before, and you are so stressed about the wedding, things are not going exactly as planned, and you run into the bathroom and you have a panic attack, and
Yeah,
you are not actually feeling what you're supposed to feel, what the
right.
Mm.
feeling rule is telling you that you're
Yeah.
supposed to feel.
Mm. Mm.
So
You're
that
doing
is
this
an
wrong in a sense.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
this, and potentially you feel, oh, there's something wrong with me.
Mm.
Right,
With you,
right.
And
yeah.
I
That's
think
why I said pressure, right? Yeah.
we will
Yeah.
get back to again, I think when it comes to children,
Yes.
because
Mm.
when you feel in a way that is inappropriate, you
Mm.
can often start pointing the finger at yourself,
Not yourself.
thinking,
Yeah.
well, what's wrong with me?
Yeah.
Why can't I be happy? It's my wedding day. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What's yeah. Yeah.
And then
Interesting.
emotion regulation is more typical psychological term.
Yeah.
That parents help children to learn how to regulate emotions. This means that with parents' support, children can go through emotions, knowing that that is safe. They have support of parents to go through these emotions and experience that, okay, after I've had this moment of sadness or I'm scared, I will be in a way on an emotional wave, and then it will calm down again. I can cry it out, I can talk about it, and then we self-regulate by being able to go through emotions,
Yeah.
and then uh, they settle. So having to adapt to a situation, it is in fact going through what you are feeling.
Yeah.
So when you have conditions, when you have parents and close ones who support you in teaching you this and being there when this happens as a child and in adolescence, we like to think that then you have a very healthy way of dealing with your emotions, of handling your emotions. Now you go to your husband or you go to your best friend for support and you cry it out and you feel better afterwards. Instead of suppressing emotions, having other survival strategies for not going through the emotions. For example, not going through grief.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So
big problem.
when a certain emotion culture has feeling rules who say this, it's not allowed to grieve now, for example,
Yeah.
it's not allowed to grieve. It's not allowed to be sad now. It's not allowed to be angry. It's not allowed to
Yeah.
be anxious. Then you will not get the support to actually get in touch with those emotions and have good ways of handling your emotional life.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
Thanks
even I'm
for
thinking
explaining that.
in my experience, not necessarily that it's outwardly stated that it's not allowed, but you have no models of people doing it. That's
Exactly.
another thing
Absolutely.
too. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is also what I mean when I write in the article that these things are not necessarily said. These are
Yes.
Exactly.
not
Yes.
Yeah.
necessarily things that are so blatantly said. So I
Yeah.
have informants who have actually said, my father said, we will never talk about this again, and you will never,
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
share these feelings. But that's
Yeah.
an exception.
That's
What
pretty exceptional.
happens, and we know it from my wedding example, that feeling rules are not necessarily spoken about. And they're not necessarily even clear to us because it's so ingrained in our culture now, the way that we have grown up. So feeling rules are often they become noticeable in the moment where you're feeling something else than you're expected to feel. That's when
Yeah,
the
I
feeling
understand.
rules become,
They reveal
you know,
themselves when you break them,
yes,
basically.
they reveal
Interesting.
themselves. So very often it's not spoken about. Like
Interesting. Yeah.
on this wedding example, people are not going to come up to you and say, "Well, you should be happy." You know,
No, yeah, yeah.
everything is very often it's unspoken rules, but we know them because we have grown up with this way of thinking that, oh, this is correct, this is not correct, this is appropriate,
Yeah.
this is not appropriate, but we don't talk about it.
Yeah, but they're still
Interesting.
ingrained, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
still ingrained. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Andrea, I
Yeah.
was thinking this might be a good time to ask about autobiographical remembering,
Mm.
because we want to make sure we
Yeah,
get to the meat of this paper. For
exactly. Yeah.
listeners, we have other questions for listeners, but some of them are quite kind of specific. And this paper is so rich that we figured we'll spend most of the time on the meat of it because we're already half an hour deep into it, and I have so many
So
so
many additional
interesting.
questions, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, you use autobiographical remembering. And
Yeah.
you also spend some time exploring the limits of the method, and you build at the same time you build an argument on why you consider it being a valid approach for for your paper.
Yes.
Can
So
you explain this a little bit more? Mhm.
yes, so I asked the participants to write about their childhood in an autobiographical way. So
Mm,
there were 32 written texts and 12
Mm,
interviews. And
okay.
mm,
especially the written texts, then people have time to create a story.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
what we see then is when you're writing in an autobiographical way, you're creating a story about yourself,
Mm,
Yeah.
and you are creating um, some connections of how some things are connected with other things
mm,
along your kind of pathway through childhood, adolescence, and into your
mm,
adult
mm,
life. And autobiographical remembering means that we have done the work of creating that story about
Okay.
ourselves.
mm,
Therefore, we have connected many things to one another. It's not necessarily that one event had to trigger another event later. It's not that simple, but when we create stories, we give meaning to different parts of our lives, and
mm,
we connect some different situations, and we have ways of remembering through autobiography. So, for
mm,
example, we can say that in in a very typical childhood, you would have kindergarten, and then you would have school, and then you would have high school, and then you studied, and then you had children, and then you had grandchildren, and that would be a typical autobiographical story. But and and this way of creating chapters in your life helps you to remember. It
Yeah.
helps us
Yeah.
mm,
remember. Yeah.
mm,
So what is interesting with the how the participants in my story wrote their autobiography, and without me asking them to, they wrote
Mm.
in a way where they always made chapters from one place to the next, to the next, to the next,
of course. Of
in
Yes.
course.
a TCK childhood. So,
Yeah.
what does that tell us? I didn't ask them to structure their autobiographies in that way.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
did it themselves. And that's what we call critical junctures in our
Mm.
Mm,
lives, critical events that in an autobiographical way feel like they were game changers, you know.
Yes.
For
mm,
Something
example,
mm.
meaningful
having a
enough to be
child
put as a
is,
bookmark. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
for example, having a child is a huge game changer in
Hmm.
most of our lives, you know.
Mm,
Hmm.
So the fact that they wrote that structure of always, then I moved there, and then I moved
Right.
there,
Right.
and that's, I think, very interesting in itself.
mm,
And because it shows how important, how fundamental this was to them, that the fact that they lived 2 years there and then their lives changed dramatically and moved somewhere else and then somewhere
mm,
else. So
Yeah.
you say also also the barriers of the challenges to autobiographical remembering, you could say it's a challenge because we will always look at our story from where we are today. So you could say that we are creating meaning back in time from the perspective of who we are right now and how we're feeling right now.
Right.
So in that sense, it is biased because, well, in 10 years' time, I might also feel different, and I've learned
Yes.
new
Of
things,
course.
and then my autobiography has also changed. So
Yeah.
I always say that autobiography is always in the making.
Yes. It's a
Yeah,
story that's
Yeah.
continually unfolding,
continually also changing. So,
changing.
Mm.
Yeah.
but what is interesting also because of that bias is that from a social scientist perspective, you can find it interesting to see, well, how are they twisting information in this way or that way? What does that say about the time we are living in,
Yeah.
society we are living in? So,
Mm.
for example, they very often they would describe how their parents are different from them being parents now. And then
Mm,
they compare different generations and different ways of child rearing, and
right.
that is from their perspective right now. But it
Mm.
also tells us something very interesting about how this twist of information says also something about our time. What is good parenting today?
Yeah.
Mm.
You know?
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
I just ask you, how old were your participants?
Yes. So all in all, there were 42 participants, and the youngest was 19 and the oldest was 78.
Okay,
Oh,
that's
wow.
important
Nice range.
information for our listeners. Yeah.
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 Yes, because what was special about that was there were at least three generations,
Right.
Yes.
of
Yes.
different perspectives, and having
Yeah.
been children within this employer organization in very different
Yeah.
Mm.
periods of time. And what's also interesting then is what was different in those different decades. But what is also s- what are the things that are similar despite someone being 78
Yes.
and having
Yeah.
grown
Yeah.
up in the 50s and
Yeah.
someone who is now 19 and
Yeah.
you know
Wow.
is so
Mm.
so it's also fascinating to see that some things seem to stay the same,
Yeah.
Yes.
and those
Okay.
things
So,
are
yeah.
yeah, those things are quite typically the TCK themes of
Right.
emotional
Mm.
relationship ruptures, um, identity problems, the very
Mm. Mm.
difficult time of coming back to
Yeah.
Norway or
Repatriation.
your what is
Mm.
supposed to be your home country.
Yeah.
These are typical TCK topics, which I also found that
Right.
were constant despite this
These
generation
age
gap.
differences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about the kind of narratives and stories that people told you. Um, assuming that people can access some credible story about their childhood, which you make the claim that they can through the feeling of emotion. From these interviews, you noticed a few things emerging that you were beginning to talk about, and you put this under the header of the life world of
Mm,
the National Foreign Service child.
mm,
And you notice that they accorded a large part of their story around relocation, which you did mention, how people normally,
Mm-hmm.
naturally kind of organize their story that way. But what did you notice in terms of how they had experienced these relocations as children? specifically? And you just started to talk about this, but please say more about it.
Yes, so one thing that was very clear was that relationships are something very difficult for very many of them. So the fact that they they have to start again in a new context, make new friends, make new connections, and then leave again, and this discontinuity of relationships is a big factor for many, and many have had to work on their emotions, grief from childhood, from moving, and the way they relate to others in adult life, because they have used survival protection mechanisms to not feel grief when they move and end relationships. So a lot of the participants had to work a lot on their emotional side of life, and they had to work on what we will normally think is unhealthy patterns of relationships, keeping people at a distance because or else it might hurt.
Hard, yeah.
The, so that was one important part. Another was that it's been very difficult for most of them to come back as hidden immigrants. That's the classic term we use in this TCK discourse. Is this concept of hidden immigrant. You come back to Norway, you look Norwegian, you sound Norwegian, your parents even think you are Norwegian and coming back home, but you are fundamentally different, and you feel like an alien in the classroom. People don't, your peers don't understand you, and for some, this kind of this um, time they kind of reintegrated into school and Norwegian society, but it was surprising to me how many became socially isolated, bullied, withdrew from social relationships, withdrew from their classmates, and isolated themselves and only wanted to go overseas again. So leaving Norway would be the solution to their social problems when coming to Norway. So for many, the solution was they just wanted the family to go overseas again because then everything would be better.
Would be better, would be normal, back to normal. Yeah.
Yes, and another interesting thing was that there was a pattern that you could notice that in early adulthood, the participants in like their 20s, they would typically continue to move. Like I mentioned that I was studying in many countries when I was at the beginning of my 20s. So you continue to move because that's what you know. And then what was interesting is when they start to get children, they decide, I don't want to move because somehow I don't want my child to experience what I experienced.
That says a lot, doesn't it?
It's a
There's a
heartbreaking
judgment in
one.
there. Yeah.
Yes, it does. And another point is this concept of privilege. So if we can go a bit deeper into that, I would
Sure.
say that that is a main finding as well in the study, that many grew up feeling that there was one truth, one story, and that was that they are privileged children. They're privileged to be moving around, experiencing all these different places in the world and cultures, and on top of that, also having a high level of economic wealth,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
when
Mm,
you're
Yeah.
overseas. So,
mm,
so this story of being privileged, I definitely would say that that is part of the Foreign Service story, that it's
Mm.
ingrained in the employer organization to say that you are privileged to be diplomats. This is a wonderful lifestyle. And that also implies that the children are very fortunate. So
Yeah.
mm,
what this does is create a culture where the truth is that you're privileged. So what does that
mm,
do if we think about feeling rules, for
Okay.
example,
Yeah.
then this implies the fact that you are understood as someone who's very lucky. You're a lucky
mm,
child, you're a fortunate child, you're a privileged child. It means that, well, why should you then be angry? Why should you be sad? Why should you be anxious? That's not appropriate because you're supposed to be happy and grateful because look, you're privileged.
mm, mm,
So
Yeah.
this story of privilege affects how children feel that they're allowed to feel and what is not allowed to feel, what is allowed
mm,
to show, express emotionally,
mm,
and
Yeah.
what is not allowed. And
mm,
and then you see also this mechanism of, oh, there must be something wrong with me if
Yeah.
I don't feel just happy or
mm,
grateful.
mm.
Do you think
And
that conclusion of there must be something wrong with me is always conscious, or can it just be where they just assume it without even realizing that there must be
yes,
I
something wrong
think
with
so,
them?
right?
Yeah.
I think that that's also a strength with the autobiography because you are now an adult thinking back.
Right.
Because
Right.
Mm,
Right. Right.
and then you're able to reflect and put other words to this and
of
by the
course.
time you're an adult, especially older adults, they know that there are other options. There are
Mm,
Yeah.
other cultures, other um, settings where, and you've met people who operate according to very different set of
Yes.
feeling rules. So you've
Yes.
been presented with other alternatives. But when
mm,
when you are a child and an adolescent growing up in this truth, you don't really know an alternative. So
yeah.
Yeah.
then you also don't really have the tools to reflect critically about that. Um, so that's also something we see as typical difference in research on TCKs is if the study has been, for example, you've interviewed children or you've interviewed adolescents, they
Mm,
will very often say, "Oh, I'm so lucky, and I get to live here and there and there, and my family is traveling all over the world, um, and so on." Whereas the same person as an
Mm.
adult who's had
Right.
children,
Right.
who's been exposed to very many other
mm,
ways of feeling and rules of how to feel, then you have tools to be able to reflect on that in
understand the
different
more
ways.
complex nature of that
Yeah.
the more complex nature of that process versus an
But it,
almost kind of cartoon-like positive versus negative
yeah.
nature when you're a kid,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, you have
Yeah,
more
and we
perspective, right?
Yeah.
yeah, and we
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
that anyway in children that
Mm.
they only know what they're used to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how
Yes,
could they know otherwise?
Mm.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then when we become teenagers, we often ask some more
Questions.
critical questions of our parents. But what is also very typical for the TCK experience is that the critical questions actually first start to show up later in adulthood.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes.
Oh, again, yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
And you
Because
also,
when
yeah.
if you ask those critical questions about the life choices and the lifestyle that your parents have chosen, if you ask those critical questions while you're still
No, now it's not the
in
time.
that
Yeah.
life,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that can be really too much
Oh,
to
yes.
Mm.
question the foundation of everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
No,
Yeah.
no, no.
That's absolutely
very
right.
often you see with TCKs that this comes much later actually in life.
Mm. Mm.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you for detailing after us. Yeah.
Yeah. And you also
And I
mentioned the exotic lifestyle, right? And I can quote here
mm,
someone who said, and then the whole thing gets this exotic character that of the
mm.
spectators pretty much requires a constant flood of exciting stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think because this is a different type of childhood to what
Mhm.
Norwegian children, for example, usually
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
And because it is associated with also elitism or being able to travel, see
Mm.
interesting places, meet interesting people, experience different cultures, this can become a way of making that child exotic and making the
Mm. Mm.
lifestyle seem it seems exotic to the observer.
Mm.
But
Mm.
what we
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
when we categorize someone's life as exotic is in fact that we project something that might not be true
Yeah. Of course.
how it is really experienced, and in a way
Mm.
we objectify someone
Yeah.
when we exotify someone,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
that's true all the way from um, studies of how anthropologists described people in the Middle East or in Africa as
Mm.
exotic cultures, exotic people. In fact, uh, you're
Yeah.
objectifying or creating some
Mm. Mm.
story that instead of asking, oh, how was that for you?
Mm.
Yes. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you
Absolutely right.
exotify, you invariably creep in there the potential of having different feeling rules and so on that you expect if it's exotic, then it must be wonderful and rich and colorful. Then therefore,
Exactly.
how
Yes.
could you not say that this was, amazing in a sense?
Mm.
And
Mm. And the,
a part of that, what's typical is people think of this lifestyle as being on constant vacation,
yeah.
because that is
Yes.
actually their reference of going to
Yeah.
different countries
Yes.
is
Yes.
Exactly.
being a tourist in that destination, whereas there is a fundamental difference between being on a holiday and
Oh
being a
my
Yes.
goodness.
tourist
Yes.
and being a child who lives in one place, then the next, then the next, and the next.
Mm.
Because
Yes.
Mm.
that is
Yeah.
everyday life, it's reality.
Exactly.
Uh,
Yes.
It's
so,
not
so
lying on the
Yeah.
beach the whole day.
yeah.
No,
Yeah.
and I can share something with listeners about this because it's really interesting. The other day, so I haven't been back to Europe in 30 something years. And the other day I was
Okay.
talking with my wife about the possibility of going there. And I was talking about how, it would be emotional for me at first. And then we were talking with the children, and my wife used the word vacation.
Mm.
And a part of me got angry at that because to me it was something sacred of going back, and to see it as a vacation was to see it in such a cheap way, a cheap kind of but then I understood, no, wait a minute, to her, how else
It
could
is a
this be
vacation.
seen?
Yeah.
It is a vacation. She's monocultural. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with it being a vacation, but I thought it was very interesting when I reacted that way, that there was something about talking about going back to France and Switzerland as a vacation, going, I don't feel okay with this description of what this trip would be, let's say. Yeah.
Because it's
Mm.
about more profound things for you.
Yes.
There are
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
profound emotional things here that of course they don't associate with
Of
going
course.
on
Yeah.
a holiday
Mm.
to Europe. And I think this exoticism is very similar to how we then talk of the global elite, the global um, migratory elite, and that they are privileged, and that, for
Mm.
example, diplomat children are privileged. You say, "Oh, you guys are lucky," you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the same as this exoticism of saying, "Oh,
Yeah.
how interesting, and this must be fascinating,"
Yeah.
and you're some kind of um, object of something that I have in my
Yeah.
imagination of someone that's
Mm.
very different. So often when I present my research, I say to the audience, "How do you feel when I come up to you and say, 'Oh, you're so lucky?'"
Right.
Yeah.
And what have
Yeah.
I done then?
Yeah.
Instead of
Yeah.
asking,
Yeah.
"How are you feeling?
How
How
are
are
you?
you really
Yeah.
Yeah.
feeling?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
How are you feeling? And who, tell me about yourself. And how was
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
for you? Instead of opening up, I'm closing
I'm
Yeah.
something
closing.
on you. I'm
Yeah.
saying
Yeah.
you were
Exactly.
lucky.
Definitely.
You
I've
were
categorized
lucky.
you already. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And now,
I
yeah.
can
And then,
reduce your
And
whole
there,
experience
and
to one
that's when,
word. Yeah.
yeah.
yes, and
Hmm.
that's when typically as children, you would take that in and think, "Oh, I'm lucky. I'm not supposed to be angry. I'm not
Right.
supposed to be grieving,
I
or
should feel blah, blah, blah.
I
Yes.
should
There are
feel
Yeah.
those feeling
happy
rules
because
again.
I'm
There we
lucky."
Yes.
go.
Yes.
Yeah. We go
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that is, I think, um, an important message, because
Yeah.
this also has to do with recognition. And a lot of the participants in my study were motivated to participate because there was a need for recognition
For
of
recognition.
that this was not as easy as many
Yeah.
think that it is.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Ragnhild, you've done a wonderful job answering all of our questions, and even those that we didn't ask because you weaved yourself into them. But one question I'd like to ask you is, so, you've been talking as the researcher, as the interviewer, the person who, collected all these wonderful narratives and so on. What about you as a person in terms of this project? I'm imagine that you didn't approach this from a neutral's perspective. Were you surprised? Were you emotionally taken aback? Were you transported to your own past when you read some of these narratives? How was that as a human feeling person, that
It's a good
experience?
question, and it's a good question for many reasons. You being a researcher,
Mm.
you know that there is not a clear divide between being a researcher and being a real
Yeah,
person.
Mm.
Because
yeah,
when you are a researcher, you will also react to
Yeah.
the information that you're getting. We're not neutral uh, unemotional people just because we are researchers. So,
Right.
the better way to do it is to acknowledge I'm a real person. I have my own autobiography. I have emotional reactions to the stories that have come in and the encounters that I've had in interviews. I'm a feeling person, even though
Yeah.
I'm a researcher. But what you can do then when acknowledging that is to see, oh, what are my feelings about when I encounter this new information? And
Yeah.
so I was very aware of my reactions, and I actually used those reactions. So if, for example, I was surprised about something, and I was surprised a lot, there was
Were you? Yeah.
so much
Can
that I
you
had
imagine?
really not expected. And
Interesting.
when I was surprised, I would use that and I'd think, oh, that's worth pursuing. That's worth digging further into, because I'm surprised. That means there's something I don't know. There's something I
Right.
haven't
Right. Right.
thought of, something I haven't read in other TCK research. So this is something I really have to go further into. And if I was provoked or getting angry or hurt, I would, I would use those reactions to tell me, oh, if this autobiography you've read now is very different from your truths about your own story, and you're feeling provoked, for example, then you use that and you say, oh, why am I reacting like this?
Right.
There must be some information here that is important
Right.
and
Right.
that I haven't thought of, or I have a different perception of. So now I'm going to challenge myself and dig into this. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
we are human, researchers are human beings. And instead of trying to not be, we should rather use it actively in our
Yeah.
methods. But that's quite
Yeah.
a revolutionary suggestion in
Yes.
many disciplines. And Mathieu,
Very much,
you work with
including in my discipline.
statistics, and
Yes.
this
Right.
is not typical talk within
Yeah.
statistics. So, but
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
believe that it can be healthy to talk about also
I
in
very much agree. Yeah.
in
Yeah. Yeah.
even statistics. We
Yes.
are we are also human beings when we
Yes.
decide which questions are we going to use for this survey.
Very much so. Very much
How do
so.
we analyze, what do these answers actually mean? Then we are human beings when we
No, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I think
Yeah.
it's a nice way to close the podcast, don't you, Andrea?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that's a
Ah,
lot to think about
thanks.
for sure.
Yeah,
Very rich.
I think it will
Very,
be
very
very
rich.
interesting. All these different topics of a privileged lifestyle, exotic life, the emotional, the feelings and the rules and everything. Lots to think about for all the listeners. As
Yes.
I assume, as adults looking back at their own life, or maybe looking at their children's lives.
Right, right. And so we invite listeners and viewers to comment on the YouTube channel or to send us if they want to send us some of their thoughts or questions, and we can even relay them to Ragnhild to see if get a conversation going. That might be interesting because I know a lot of people have different stories and a lot
Yeah.
of
Is
emotion
your
tied to these stories.
is your paper available in open access?
yes, it
Yes,
is.
okay,
Oh, good,
perfect. So we put the link into the show
good.
notes. Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah. So if
perfect.
listeners want to read the paper, we'll put a link so they can read
Yeah,
it directly,
And
which is a
if
good
it's
thing because not all papers are. Yeah.
yeah,
Yes, and if it is blocked, because it can vary what the journals do, then just get in touch and I can
Okay.
send
All
it
right,
over.
so we'll put your
Perfect.
email
I
in the
will
show
then.
notes as well if you want. And perfect. Well, Ragnhild, we want to thank you very, very much for coming on and taking the time to unpack all of this. Could have kept going for hours. Who knows? Maybe we'll do another episode where we can talk more about
Thank you
this.
very much for having me. I really appreciate being able to connect the third culture kid topic with also research and why
Mm-hmm.
research is important. And research is not just another opinion. There's
True.
Yes.
something very important about the quality of what we do that needs to be communicated in these sorts of
Mm-hmm.
platforms. So thank you
Agreed.
for having me.
Thanks so much for
Perfect.
coming on. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody. See you in the next
Bye.
episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of the TCK Research Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Please subscribe, like, and share our podcast and leave us a review. It really helps others find us. If you have any questions or comments, please write to us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we promise we'll answer all emails. We wish you a good day wherever you are, and we hope you'll join us again for the next episode.